You're listening to The White Rabbit, conversations on the art of presenting in a rather noisy world. Your hosts are Matt Krause and Alper Rozanes. Matt helps leaders of international companies speak, write, and present with confidence. Alper is a communications trainer and a startup investor with a diverse portfolio of companies in Barcelona. If you like this podcast, please share it with friends and colleagues. Now, on to Matt and Alper for today's conversation.
Alper, today we have a guest on the podcast, Brad Farris. Yes. Brad is a business coach based in Chicago. His client base is agency founders, so in other words, people like us and many of our listeners. I met Brad when I participated in a series of group coaching sessions that he led earlier this year. It was a great series, and I always enjoyed the conversations and hearing Brad's take on things. So thank you very much, Brad, for joining us on the podcast today.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
One of the things that I really appreciate about Brad is that he's great at keeping us focused on the big picture, reminding us of the why of what we are doing. It's so easy for us, especially when we are just paying attention to getting by, buried deep in the day-to-day aspects of our jobs, to focus strictly on the what and the how of what we're doing. And then along comes Brad, someone to remind us of the bigger picture of what we are doing. That's what brings us to our topic for today. But Brad, before we get into today's topic, tell our listeners if they want to get in touch with you. Brad, where can they find you?
The best place to find information about me is at my company website, anchoradvisors.com.
Anchoradvisors.com. Did I get that right?
You did.
Okay. So on to today's topic. Brad, talk to us a little bit about the bigger picture. So when a speaker is up there in front of the room, giving a presentation to a relatively small group, like a company board, for example, a presentation that, this presentation could make or break the speaker's life. So besides the slides and hitting the clicker at the right time and remembering what they're planning to say, besides the tactical stuff like that, what's the bigger picture? What else is the speaker?
So when I think about situations like that, there are kind of three levels that I want to think about. The first level is sort of self-awareness or self-leadership. So what's going on inside us as we're stepping up to that podium.
Okay.
The second level is what's going on between me and any one person in the audience, right? So all influence is one-to-one. We need to make a connection individually. And then the highest level is sort of what is the energy in the room? What's going on with us as a collective that we need to be aware of? So does that make sense on those three levels?
Yeah. Tell us a little more in particular about, you mentioned the last thing, what's going on in the room. What did you mean by that?
So I think we tend to think about presentations as I'm trying to move this group of people in a certain direction, right? But that's not really what happens. We move individuals, right? That one-on-one level is where the persuasion happens. And because we have mirror neurons and we are kind of a herd animal,
sure,
we will start to pick up clues from some of those individuals, and we can see that spread through the room. And so there's a zeitgeist, there's a feeling in the room, or there's an energy that's happening that we also need to be aware of. But I think before we can do that, we really have to focus on that self-leadership, because when what's going on inside us is screaming, it's really hard to have that higher level of sensitivity of what's happening in the. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. And when you mentioned the self-leadership, what did you mean by that phrase, self-leadership? What do you mean by that?
So self-leadership, it means that when I'm leading myself, that means that my emotions and my reactions are under control. In other words, I'm not reacting to what's going on. I'm choosing how I need to respond to what's going on, and that I'm not letting, the way our brain works, we can either have our emotions be in charge or our rational selves be in charge. And when our emotions start to get in control, our rational self starts to dial back. And so we need to be in control of that and not reacting or responding to that.
Okay.
Can I give you an example that might help?
Sure, go for it.
That would be great, yeah.
When I was in high school, I was on the speech and debate team. And we were a very competitive speech and debate team. And our coach, one of the first things that she would say to me is, if you're not nervous walking up to the podium, I don't want you up there.
Huh.
And what she was saying there is that nervousness, those nerves that we feel, that means we care. That means this is important to us, right? That's a heightened sense of awareness of what's going on. And we get nervous because we care about what we're doing. And so if we're taking it too casually, if we're not paying attention to that, then when we're not feeling that nervousness, we're not at our best. Does that resonate for you guys about that importance of nervousness?
Yeah.
Yes, it does. And one thing that I think in particular is we get a lot of people as presentation trainers. A lot of our clients will think of that nervous as a bad thing. They're like,
Correct.
okay, this nervous is getting in the way. How do I eliminate this nervousness? And here you are coming in with the different perspective, which is that nervousness is actually kind of a good thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And so it's a good thing because it tells us that we're doing something that's important. Now, they aren't wrong that it can get in the way. Though that's a really important observation, because nervousness is actually about us, right? What if they don't like me? What if I screw up? What if I say something stupid? But in order for us to be persuasive, we really need to be focused on the audience. So we walk up there with that nervousness, but in order to move that energy to where we need it to be, we need to move to focusing on the audience. And when we start to focus on the audience, a lot of that nervousness goes away because now we're in a more of a service mode. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And Alper, I don't want to hog the conversation here. So do you want to jump in at this point? Do you have anything that you want to jump in at this point with?
I have several questions, but I also don't want to hog, so I'll just start with one of.
Sure.
And Brad, I'd like to ask you, so what is your why? How did you get involved in this journey? How did you become so passionate about focus on the big picture in presentations, as I understand in communication in general?
Yeah, that's a really great question. When I was in corporate life, I was proud of my presentation skills. Like I used to say, I give really good PowerPoint. But I realized at some point that delivering a great presentation did not always get the result that I was looking for. And for me, I am really about getting those results. I want to see people move from point A to point B, right? And so in order to do that, there were all these layers that I had to untangle, like what's going on inside of me. What happens when I get nervous or I get scared? And then what's happening on the other side? How am I maintaining people's attention? How am I connecting one-on-one with people? And then like we talked about, that larger group of how do we get the group to reinforce those changes that I'm making one-on-one? Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Brad, I've got
I have more.
Wanted to ask.
Go ahead,
for
Matt.
it, Alper. Oh,
No, go ahead.
So Alper and I are fighting over who gets to talk to Brad next. Okay, so I'll go with one thing, and then I'll turn it over to you, Alper. Okay. So Brad, one thing that you mentioned was that you mentioned something about persuasion, and you just kind of mentioned it in passing. You were talking about something else. So a lot of people think of the goal of a presentation is to persuade people of something, to change their minds about something, to make them see the world exactly the way that you do. And to do exactly what you want them to do. So talk to us a little bit about that. Do you think that's a good way to look at it, or is that the wrong way to be looking at it?
Yeah, I really like the way you said that, because definitely my goal is not to get them to see the world exactly the way I see it. I go into a conversation or a presentation assuming that there are things that I know and there are things that the people in the room know. And we need to get all of that out on the table so that we together can come to the best outcome, right?
Sure.
And so by bringing out some information from the audience or from the group that we're talking to, we can together produce a better result. And then if they're participating, if they're co-creating that result with me, they're going to be more invested in it than if I come in there and I'm basically beating them down until they agree with what I say. Their desire to pursue that after the conversation is a lot less.
And before I turn it over to Alper, I actually have one more question for Brad, and that is that Brad, you're kind of discussing or describing this presentation style as a two-way conversation.
Yes.
And so a lot of people, they go into a presentation looking at at it as a one-way form of communication. I'm going to stand up there on stage, or I'm going to stand up in front of the room or whatever, and I'm going to talk, and I'm going to show some slides, and I'm going to sweat a little and be nervous, and it's all going to be one way, and these people are just going to sit there and listen to me, and then at the end, maybe if we're lucky, we'll have some two-way conversation. So are you envisioning, what does this two-way conversation look like?
That's a great question. I think that the experience that I had that dissuaded me of the one-way communication mindset, I was standing in front of a board of directors meeting, and I was there to talk about asking them to make an investment in a particular project. And the meeting had been very contentious just prior to my presentation. And so I got up there and everyone's kind of irritated and tired. And right as I begin to start, the CEO looks at me and says, "Brad, before you start, I want to see your last slide."
Okay.
And I said, "Okay, what am I going to say? He's the CEO." So I put my last slide up. And he said, "I agree 100% with where you're going here. I think you've got that exactly right. The fact that you did all the work to put this presentation together means that I know you believe what you're saying. Knowing that I agree with you, is there anything in the rest of the deck that I need to see?" I'm like, "Nope, nothing."
That's great.
Nice.
Right?
Yeah. So Alper,
right. If I had come in and insisted on making that whole presentation, I would have unconvinced people where they were already convinced, right? And so by having that two-way conversation, it made the whole thing better and allowed them to get their meeting back on track.
True.
And save a huge amount of time in the process.
Exactly. And save a huge amount of time.
Brad, I wanted to throw you a curveball.
Yeah.
We talked about emotions and authenticity and the importance of that, in especially business presentations. But my question is this: what would your advice be for someone who has a high-stake presentation tomorrow, let's say to the board? The results are not good. He knows it, they know it, everybody knows.
Yes.
And let's say in the training, I say things like, be authentic, show your emotions, just focus on but focus on the why instead of just focus on the what and the how. And this man would say, what on earth are you talking about? I'm going to put my soul out there tomorrow at this high-stake presentation. What advice would you give to someone in that situation?
First of all, I want to acknowledge just how challenging that situation would be, right? And a lot depends on the environment in which you're presenting that. Like, is this a safe environment for you to be authentic? Or is this a situation where you're going to present bad news and everyone's going to get their machine guns out and their rocks and start flinging things at you, right?
We do not condone violence on this podcast.
But I think we've all been in that room.
Yeah, this is true.
Yes.
So assuming that it's a relatively safe environment, I think that I need to think about what is it that I'm trying to accomplish? It's getting back to your why. What am I trying to accomplish by presenting this bad news, right? There's one way that I can present it that's inviting a public flogging. That's probably not what I'm there to do, right? If I have bad news, I'm either asking for help or I have an idea about how we're going to work our way out of it, right? And so I think it's being very clear about why I'm coming in there. And if everybody knows there's bad news, I think I would start out with that. Like, there's no surprises in this presentation. This project is off track. Like, get the bad news out there first, and then engage the audience. Like I said, depending on where you want this to go, either to help you or in drafting a way out of that. But I think if you're coming in with bad news, I think you got to get that out there right away. Now,
agreed.
That said, what's going on inside you? Before I went to give that presentation, I would really have to work through, how do I feel about that bad news? What does that bad news say about me, right? Because I'm going to have all those feelings when I get up there, and I want to have worked on them before I got in front of the group, right? I don't want to be working out my feelings in front of this whole team.
Yeah.
I want to do that work before I get up to the podium. Does that help? Did that answer your question? Yes.
So preparation is key. And I liked how you not framed, but you discussed, okay, if I'm presenting bad news, I'm either asking for help or I have something to contribute on how to elevate the situation, just for the sake of making your life more at this moment.
Yes.
What would you say if this person said, well, I'm not sure exactly what help to ask for, and I have absolutely no idea on the remedies, but I still have to make this presentation about the bad news. So what do I do? So is canceling it an option, for example, or asking for a delay?
Right. I think that at that point, I would want, so in corporate, there was always the meeting before the meeting, right? That what's happening in the meeting to some extent is rehearsed, or there's not a lot of surprises that are coming out there. So I would want to have a conversation with the convener of that meeting and maybe some of the key stakeholders to say, this is the situation. It's bad, and I don't have a really good answer. What are we trying to accomplish in this presentation? Because we all know that the news is bad. Do we want to know how bad it is? Do any of you have anything to contribute? What's the outcome that we're looking for here? Because to have a meeting where we're not clear on the outcome is just likely to lead to a lot of frustration from everybody, right?
Yeah.
So getting that clarity, if you aren't bringing that clarity, you need to get that from the stakeholders.
I understand. I like that advice.
It's about
Well, I really like this conversation, and I wouldn't. Yeah, I'm not going to make your life more difficult, Brad, because I love this conversation, and I would love to have you back on the podcast.
That's great. I would love to do that.
For today, that will be it on my side.
Okay.
One thing that it's about time for us to wrap up this podcast. But one thing I'd like to dig deeper in future weeks and future episodes is this thing that Brad has mentioned, because I think it's a very interesting point that you make, Brad, that the person who's presenting, especially if there's bad news that's being presented, like a project being off track or something like that, especially if there's bad news being presented, the person who's presenting probably has a lot of emotions flowing around, and you want to, you used a great phrase, you want to work out those emotions before the presentation. You don't want to be working out those emotions during the presentation, right there in front of the board. And so the need to work out these emotions and what those emotions might be, I think that would make a very interesting next couple of episodes for us to do, Alper.
Yes, I agree.
So I just wanted to thank you for joining us on the podcast today, Brad.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. It's a pleasure.
This was fun. I love talking about this stuff.
And Alper, I will see you next week then.
Next week. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to The White Rabbit with Matt Krause and Alper Rozanes. You can subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or through your favorite feed.